Let's see. So welcome, Alex. It's a real delight to engage with your work. You've done some really important ethnographic studies here, looking at one particular species of pangolin, not in fact the one that was sort of tied to the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2. It's not Manus javanensis, but Manus pentadactyla. But you're tracing, the broad trade in pangolins in this illicit market, and in part what this article is doing is offering us an account of the economic logics that might be fueling, this trade, looking at how an economics of scarcity and desire is fueling this illicit economy, but also, I think more importantly, looking at more subtle dynamics that are happening in these highland regions, and I'm going to mispronounce it. Arunachal Pradesh. Am I sort of saying that right?
Arunachal Pradesh. Yes.
And this is a part of India that I hadn't really sort of paid attention to much before. So here we're situated between Tibet, Myanmar, Bhutan, Assam, and you're telling us a story of people who go out into the forest and have these intergenerational relationships where hunters are worried about kind of doing the wrong thing and having, black swan event. So, there's a line in there where, hunters are sometimes expecting to pay for their success in hunting with a child. So, people see this as very high stakes work, and also work that involves a kind of mutual flourishing and exchange when done right. And you're invoking some of the multi-species conversation here. So I'd love to hear, how you're thinking about, the reporting that's happened over the last year related to pangolins. We could talk in some detail about that. We've discussed the original pangolin paper a number of times in terms of, what kind of genomic evidence links it to that particular virus, to SARS-CoV-2, but we actually haven't discussed much about pangolins themselves. One interesting finding from the primary scientific literature, published just a couple of weeks ago, is that there were no pangolins or bats in the Wuhan seafood market. That was just published in, I'm forgetting which journal, but someone who'd done a long-term study of the wildlife trade in that market and had actually, over a number of years been kind of keeping track of what was being sold, what kinds of permits were on offer, what permits weren't there, but, significantly like the species and numbers of animals there. So, the story starts to fall apart a little bit when you pick at it, but, there was a pangolin, it's connected to the pandemic, and there's this very lucrative market that you're describing here. So I'd love to just kind of hear your take on, how this has all been reported and any shifts that you've seen in this marketplace over the last year.
Well, it's worth saying that it, like as you've indicated, that it's a fragmented story at the moment. There's different narratives that are still weaving through the role of, or the lack of a role of, pangolin as vectors for the virus. So we're seeing sort of changes over the last few months, as you know, in terms of seeing the pangolins as a cause or not, or as a vector. I mean, I think that some of the most recent, this is not my specialist area, but I believe that some of the most recent laboratory studies indicate the spike protein of pangolins indicates that it could transmit from pangolins to humans, but the transmission from bats to pangolins would be very difficult indeed. In some ways, that the coronavirus is highly adapted to human infection. So this is an ongoing story, and it's this whole narrative of whether we're talking about the virology lab in Wuhan as a source, or as the wet markets of Wuhan as a source. This is a story that's still unfolding. Really, what for me, the sort of the reason for writing the paper was because I just saw a very different spirit of calculation between indigenous people on the ground and the way that the cash economy and markets tend to work. That's why I focused in on scarcity value and the way that value, different values, cultural values, medicinal value, but also economic value, the way that they interact with scarcity and also alterity. So, you know, what we find in so many areas of the cash economy, and you find it, you know, even in my own children, the way that they exchange Lego and things like this, you see that scarcity, it just always seems to raise the value of something, you know, and this is something we find in so many areas of human culture. And yet there was this apparent counterpoint with hunters in the uplands of Arunachal, where as you know, these often the surprise sighting of a creature or a rare creature that's rarely seen, and it also included animals that were often hidden from view. I mean, I could talk about this idea of the interiority of certain animal habitats and how that was linked into spirits. You know, something I don't talk about in the paper so much, but which really featured in a big way in terms of their understanding of spirits and understanding of spirit wealth. That there was a counterpoint. It was a different spirit of calculation, and I tried to show in the paper that it doesn't necessarily mean that people don't hunt pangolin or don't hunt other animals. And in fact, a lot of these taboos are breaking down with the rise of Christianity in this part of Northeast India, and with the increased expansion of roads and the cash economy. But it was an alternative spirit of calculation, and one that featured in a big way in the way that people talk about wildlife, and it linked in very much into their senses of space. So the way that they set up and maintained in their rituals, there was a lot of emphasis upon the borders that were created and maintained, and often they were speaking directly to the spirits that owned these animals, that we have maintained the border. We maintain the border between us, the human village, and you, your spirit villages. So it's like Eduardo Viveras de Castro's sort of vision of the society of nature, or Descola's vision of the society of nature. It was all very hybrid. It was all there was no purification of, you know, society and nature, no word for nature. And when you divest yourself of that separation, other borders come up. How do you create, what is the border between the forest and the village? And this became a really big focus for me in the research, and it delivered some of these results. Yeah.
I'm really interested too in the economic logics that you describe. You talk about the over-exploitation vortex, and you know, I think this is something that's relevant for the broad field of extinction studies. And I'm also really interested in how the logics break down too. So you've got these economic theories, some that are positing, you know, there should be a certain economic point where the trade breaks down. Like that was one kind of economic model, but then there was another that was kind of looking at a sort of an intensification of value as scarcity intensifies. And, you know, what do, like, maybe if we're looking at these markets from the wrong end of a telescope, if we're looking at these markets from the different situated values that you are accounting for in these multi-species worlds, you know, how do these logics of scarcity and also the idea of traditional Chinese medicine, like how is that viewed from far away? And you know, what are kind of the ethical calculations that people are making outside of these realms? You know, within these realms, you're just describing the kinds of calculations one might make vis-a-vis the spirit world, but are there other kinds of ethical calculations that local folks are making whether or not to participate in these global markets that are illicit.
Well, I mean, one of the sort of features of all of this, you know, over the last 15 years, Arunachal Pradesh, it really wasn't on my geographic map when I first went out to India. It was an environmental journalist who recommended I go and work there. And I thought he was talking about Andhra Pradesh, and it was a different state altogether. I'd never heard of it. One of the reasons that it was completely off the map is that there's a history behind it, which was the Indo-China border war in 1962. A few years after the Dalai Lama escaped through Arunachal Pradesh, the western portion of it, into India, Chinese troops amassed on the border and then invaded Arunachal Pradesh. And they still claim it as part of Arunachal Pradesh, as part of China. It's a contested, geopolitically contested area. Now, why I'm saying this is because up until so where I work, the administration didn't exist until the 1960s. It was a completely uncolonized area. It was called the Northeast Frontier for several centuries, and then the Northeast Frontier Agency. When I first went there in the early 2000s, no one had actually worked there for 40 years, no foreign researcher. And so the government was very resistant to anybody coming in and working there. But I met some people from the tribe who had been educated down in Assam, and they got in contact with officials with sort of political figures within their tribe, who then wrote to the government, and they allowed me and gave me a research visa to work for 2 years. So there was very little research, very little known about the area. I wasn't given any maps. I wasn't you had a presence of the military presence on the border was there. A single road going up to Kaloriang, just to give a sense of how remote it was. It was 16 hours from the capital by a single dirt road that often had landslides. There was no modern medicine up there. There was no telephones in the villages, or electricity or internet. People were living in that first period, totally based upon their sort of interactions with the local landscape. Now the cash economy is expanding, and it was at the advent when just as it was starting to expand, the road, and since that time, based again upon the Indo-China border war and the threat of Chinese claims for Arunachal, the road network has developed and it's expanded. So places that I walked to, which took 2 days to walk through, or 3 days to walk through the forest, now have a road going to them. Okay, and we know that across the tropics, road accessibility often triggers a decline in wildlife. This is something that's been found over and over again. And with it comes cash and the expansion of the cash economy. So the local township nearest to the villages where I was working has now expanded. And I think that brings its own calculations into the picture, different calculations. Christianity has expanded as well. So you get these, it's like as Max Weber sort of understood it with regard to values, that we can, even individuals within communities, there may be many different value spheres. And also in each of us individuals, we have, we hold within ourselves different value spheres. And I think that one value sphere that has come into prominence over the last few years has been the way that cash and scarcity interact in the appropriation of wildlife, and the way that then interacts with local perceptions of spirit ownership of animals. And there was nothing particularly lovely about their visions of spirit ownership. There was a lot of fear surrounding it, and the ficus religiosa, the sacred fig tree, That was there as a prominent marker between the village lands and the spirit lands. But, you know, people in the village, they wanted to cut that tree down. The only reason they didn't is because whenever they did oracles, it said that it would be a very bad idea to do that. So these kind of borders, whilst they maintained the borders, there was also two different spirits of calculation going on there, which was in the village economy. In the village, we want to flourish, yeah, and we could flourish more if we expand our fields up into the temperate forest there even. But then there was an alternative spirit of calculation, which was, what about the feelings of the master spirits, or these spirit owners of wildlife? How will they then respond to this? How will they feel about this? And what wealth will they take back? So it was a whole cosmology of exchange that was going on there. The economics of the modern sort of cash economy economics is more familiar to us. It's about, you know, increasing number of middlemen now that are working on behalf of the, you know, supplying the growing middle class in the capital with bushmeat. You've got like various sort of halfway shops that are kind of setting up around the road network. The border with Bhutan has become quite porous, and so like, there's wildlife that's being transported from Arunachal into Bhutan and then up into Nepal, where it can then be distributed into other areas of Asia. And then also you had historically the inner line separated, a border separated Arunachal Pradesh from Assam to the south. Now that border again has proven to be porous, and is again, there's a lot of wildlife that is flowing through that border now. So you know, it was when I first went there, and still up in the uplands away from roads, people that sort of spirit of calculation that really sort of took into account the feelings of spirits for purely selfish human reasons, I would say. In a lot of ways, it was not because they cared about spirits, it's because they cared about not being the spirits becoming vengeful. That has started to mix and meld with these other spirits of calculations, more sort of traditional cash economy related spirits, and that's where it stands today. However, I think the role of conservationists, I should say this, the role of conservationists should be to potentially work, if they can work with these traditional ways of understanding the forest. They might find that certain borders can be self-monitored by local people, and that there's certain familiarity with borders between village lands and, you know, spirit lands, you know, and these can be worked with, but it requires subtlety amongst conservationists, and that kind of squaring that circle between conservation and development, which is sort of grail of conservation in some ways. Yeah.
Super interesting. Thanks, Alex. So Rachel's got her hand up, and anyone else who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand or feel free to write something in the chat.
Hey, Alex, thanks for being with us. I really loved this piece, and I as an oral historian, I'm actually really want to ask you more methodologically related questions down the line. But I first want to kind of piggyback off of what you were just talking about in working with conservationists, and I just want to pull up from my notes in your piece that sort of last page, or the end of the second to last page, in which you talk about you make a move in your piece, and you turn directly to conservationists. You say conservationists willing to collaborate with local hunters, and you make the following recommendations. And I really found this a fascinating move in the piece. And you listed, I mean, I want to say like seven really fascinating suggestions, exploring hunting taboos and species to which they pertain, in a context of wildlife declines, do not search for an ethos of care or protection solely in the human domain, look to the more than human domain, listen to local stories for clues to perceived human limits, recognize the depth of hunting, and you move on. There were so many fascinating proposals there, and I just wondered if you would say more about coming to this conclusion to make this move in your piece? What local people and interviewees were kind of talking about or responding to in relation to these ideas. I think these are so fascinating also in the context of a group that has read quite a bit of the work on the One Health model, and Wim is here joining us as well. So I'm so curious to just hear you say a little bit more about this move in your piece.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's really interesting. My feeling with these, my abiding feeling is that the indigenous cosmology is not. It really isn't capable of withstanding the power of the cash economy. I don't think that that it's enough to remain just with their intrinsic village level ideas about wildlife, because I could see that this flood of new values was coming in. So it then sort of raises the question, what can be done? Is there anything that can be done in sort of implemented based upon this value system? And that's really where I turn to conservationists, because I feel that so often there isn't this communication, this dialogue with local hunters, and yet this is it. What I saw was that that hunting identities were very, very entrenched, and this is an area of India where hunting is carried on legally for generations. And there's not only that, you've got shotguns coming into up the road system, and like I say, cash. So to work with local people in a language that they can speak as well, that language that they're fluent in, that they feel capable of talking in, I think this has value. But it requires a kind of exchange of perspectives, and in some ways it requires a move away from the naturalistic language that is common amongst conservationists, which often has a purified vision of society and nature underlying it. It's, like I say, a hybrid and a society of nature in which people live, and yet it is deeply felt. These are deeply felt things. One of the triggers for my understanding of spirit ownership was actually people's deaths in the village. People had died. It's an area of India with some of the lowest life expectancy. When I was there, the average life expectancy was 42, which is very low compared to most areas of India. And there's zero literacy in most of the villages, and it was, like I say, remote, based upon the history of the way that India had encountered and sort of interacted with Arunachal. So for me, it counts to, like, how does one activate? You can't necessarily ask a conservation organization to jump into an animistic framework. It's very hard to do that, but to start those conversations, that you actually start to also be able to unpick some of the dynamics going on in terms of people's identities. So one of the things I found at the village level was when you go and do field work, you go to a village that seems to have no plastic, no electricity, no telephones, none of these emblems of modernity. And you can easily assume, when you see someone doing a ritual, that it's always been like that, or that it's been like that for a few generations. And I know that that's an illusion, and I know that's a projection based upon a kind of strange Rousseauian pernicious vision of people, living in a sort of perpetual, I'll be honest, I those sort of illusions, I had to break them down in my own mind when I was there, because it seemed like they seemed to be outside of modernity. But what I found is, for example, something that seemed to be very established, for example, the hunting ritual called Nyoying the chanting was so sophisticated and so nuanced, and there was so many inbuilt images there, and there was such a sophistication within it, that I just assumed that it had been like that for some time, because they're often referring also back to ancestors and how they did it. I'm doing it like you did it, like Abu Tani, the first human being, did it, etc. And then you find that after a little bit further inquiry, you find that actually the little microcosmic tree that they build and they cut into the branches and add flowers to, that it wasn't always like that. Once it was an arrow. And then you look at the skull rack, where the hunters would keep the skulls of animals that they'd killed, and they'd hang them from a rack on the back of the longhouse, and spatter the blood of the animals onto the skulls as a kind of gift to their tutelary hunting spirits, you could say. I just assumed that that's just how people did it. And then I looked a little bit, as later on in fieldwork, I realized that actually they didn't do it like that, even just a generation ago. That it used to be that the skull rack was inside the longhouse, and the tutelary spirits were blood exchanges were given inside the longhouse. And so, well, why have all the hunters, the three main hunters in the village, why have they all moved their skull racks to the back platform of the longhouse? And then you find there's a whole sort of interpersonal history that underpinned it. And what it was is, some people had died in the village over the last few years, and people started to suspect that the tutelary spirits of some hunters were responsible for it. Not only that, looking a bit deeper, I found that the punung spirits, or hunting spirits, that each hunter had, and which they said that they had inherited from like long ago, different legendary hunters going back into the past, that these punung spirits were not fixed. They're not fixed. That it's only because you feed them that they help you hunt, yeah, and fundamentally protect you in the forest. So what was actually happening, I started to realize, was that you had this kind of intersection of different things going on. You had a few deaths in the village. You had less blood being given, wildlife blood being given to the punung spirits, and the perception amongst hunters and others in the village that as a result, the punung spirits of these hunters were becoming restless, and they could start to consume the life of people in the village. So they were responding to that decline. That there was a decline in wildlife that was occurring around that village over the last 10 years. Shotguns had come up into the uplands. Outsiders had followed the road network up. There'd been a decline in the hunting, the availability of wildlife, and this resulted in less blood being able to be given to the tutelary spirits, and a sense of unease that these spirits were going to start to consume humans instead. And so they moved them to the back of the longhouse, so they were facing back to the forest. Yeah, these skull racks. Something that seemed static was actually highly dynamic. And not only that, I asked the hunters in the village, Talon village where I worked particularly, so what happens if they do become restless, these punung spirits? What's going to happen to you? And they said, well, and this was a really crucial realization for me. And again, I'm going to bracket this off and say this does not mean that they're going to be able to conserve the wildlife through their indigenous environmental knowledge, because the cash economy will flood it. But it is that they said, well, the punung will become restless, and in the end, the punung will leave and go somewhere else. And then what? And I said, well, what happens to you then? And they said, well, then I'll become a shaman. Then I'll become a shaman. I will a nyubu. I will gather hulu spirits and start to sacrifice domestic animals of the village animals. So what I started to see was this sort of this ecological dynamic in the wildlife was translating into a social and structural dynamic in the village, where a decline in wildlife, and it seemed to have a beautiful logic. Yeah, the decline in wildlife was triggering the decline in hunting identities and also a movement of practice away from hunting wildlife to instead killing domestic animals as part of spirit rituals and giving those and the main spirits they were giving them to was these spirit owners of wildlife. So you had this kind of structural, this shift in practice that was actually occurring due to the changes in the environment. And I thought, as you do, I thought, okay, this is fantastic. There's actually an adaptation going on here. At a very deep level, people are starting to loosen their ties with hunting here. But of course, it's not enough, because it's not enough to preserve wildlife, because most of the hunters that were coming in with guns were not accomplished hunters with punung spirits. They were called gamsung, which is hunters that have no spirits associated with them and little protection from the spirit owners of wildlife. But it was an interest. It's something that lies there as an indigenous logic. How you then implement, but it's something that I feel that these things are latent and can be worked with by conservationists. They can, even if it's just to create a dialogue about such things.
Super interesting response, and I might add that one of my favorite phrases in here, as you're talking about some of these dynamics, is the experiment. So in moving the skull racks, you talk about it as an experiment, and it seems like a lot of these, shifting modalities or relationalities might be understood as experiments. Cesar, you have your hand up.
Hi, Alex. Thank you so much. Really interesting to hear you out and to hear about your fieldwork. It's really fascinating, and it kind of goes along with a lot of the work I've been doing. I was wondering whether you could develop a bit more how the punung become vengeful. So what happens, kind of in, I don't know, what is the effect? How does it go about? And the question behind it is, I have sort of a hypothesis that I've been forwarding, and is that you could translate some of what we understand as microbes as some of what is understood as punung. That is the main thing behind it.
Great. Could you just extrapolate a little bit that second question about microbes, and it's very interesting, the link between microbes and tutelary spirits.
Okay, there's a book, I can send you a link to that. Well, basically the idea is that you have many of the, at least in South American, the way they were translated, the spirits, many of the qualities they have is bodies, and often some of the entities were strictly related with infectious diseases like syphilis. So you have a possibility of translation, and I would say the contemporary notion of microbes is not European. It wasn't European to start with. So it's more a mixture of both things. So I'm more interested in hearing, okay, how do they act in that case?
It's really interesting, that link between microbes and the transmission of spirits and the infection of communities. So they one of the first ceremonies that I went to was up in this really remote township at the confluence of three rivers that was quite important for Nyishi senses of their sort of migration through the hills over several centuries. People had very sort of long memories of, deep memories of their ancestors and migrations. So the average person in the village could remember back around 35 generations down the Patry line. going back to, for them, the first human being, Abu Tani. And certain events in those lives, legendary, getting more and more mythological as you go back in time. And also, like in a lot of sort of Amazonian, Amerindian sort of visions, you know, gradually humans become, and humans and spirits start to sort of, the boundary between them blurs. When you get back to the first human being, he's a sort of half spirit, half human. He's going up and down to the sort of sun, and, you know, sort of talking to the sun, and then also marrying lots of lots of animals and plants that have a human form. So classic perspectivist vision of deep history. But that first ceremony, called Longte Yulo, it was effectively a ritual that a ceremony that people performed straight after sowing their fields around April. And they would finish sowing the fields, the jum fields. It's a sort of shifting cultivation that they perform there, the rice and millet. And then straight afterwards, they'd all retreat to the village. Everyone would stay in the township or in the village, and no outsiders were allowed to come in. Okay, it was completely banned that anyone. And the way that people described it was, no one should come in for fear of bringing spirit illness. Okay, so it was a border was erected there, and what it did was it played out an old story in which two hunters, Fade and Faga, who were like sort of ancestors of a lot of upland clans, not the lowland Nyishi clans, but upland clans, that they had gone up hunting into the forest, and they'd found a hunting cave. They'd gone and set their traps in the evening, and then they had come back to the cave, and they found two women who were over a fire. They were taking 1 grain of rice, putting it into a pot, and it becomes a full pot of rice. They then marry these two women and find out afterwards that they are the daughters of the mountain spirit Dorjung, this extremely powerful, slightly godlike, but also quite human in other ways, spirit called Dorjung. They then, in patrilineal fashion, decided to return to the human village with these daughters of the spirit of the mountain. And just before they set off, the girls tell them, the women tell them, whatever you do, don't turn back. Yeah, whatever you do, don't turn back to the forest. So these two hunters, they set off with the gifts, the bride wealth of, it's actually the bridal gifts of Dorjung. Okay, and he decides to give them different animals, wild animals that they can return to their village with. But as the story goes, as they return to the village, the sound becomes louder and louder behind them until it's like thunder. Yeah, and suddenly, with a crack of sort of thunder, they then turn around, raise their bows, look behind them, and in that moment, all the wild animals flood back into the forest. Yeah, so all that was wild remains wild in our sort of categories, and that which is of the village remains of the village. And you get this, I mean, you know, there's a lot of problems obviously with the work of Levi-Strauss, but one of the things that I think he did identify is the way that myth tests and stress tests the categories that we have, the divisions that we make in the world. And I found that a lot of the stories that Nyishi have, they test this boundary between spirit ownership, or the wild in our terminology, and village animals, whether it's village animal wealth, or spirit or forest animal wealth. And it's always testing it, and then you find the border stays, the border remains, you know. Now, how does that link into sort of transmission of microbes and such like? Well, people definitely, up until and still in the time that I was working there, they saw, you know, certain epidemics as caused by certain spirits, but this was in decline during the time that I was there. They called them dolly spirits, and they kind of, or dolly uyu, and they were in decline. However, you know, a lot of illness was attributed to spirits, and there was one time I got a friend of mine who was a shaman. He was a very sort of experienced shaman. I asked him, it was the best question I think I ever asked him, actually. I said, so can you list the spirits? And I thought there would be about 20 spirits maybe, or 50 spirits possibly. And one evening he did that, and he just got me and my research assistant, this was quite early on in the research, to break lots of bamboo, and then he started counting them out round the square hearth that they have in the longhouses. And it went on for a long time, and it went through to over 140 different spirits in 2 different kingdoms, different classes, left-handed spirits and right-handed spirits, or Nyori spirits, Nyobia spirits, and then not only that, they had different places in which they dwelt and different effects upon human beings. Each one of them had a different effect. And it was not purified out as nature society. There was things that dealt with, human illness, madness, oratory, all sorts of different qualities that they upheld and undermined in different ways. So there was a whole diagnostic system that the Nyibu had, and which informed the way that people understood illness, and and then of course that interacts with modern medicine as it moves into such areas, and you get different visions, different spirits of calculation, different values coming in. So that's where we are today. But there was very much about an idea of creating. This was just so essential to village, creating borders. Borders underpinned human flourishing at the deepest possible cosmological level. So humans have a parallel life as jungle oxen in the land of the sun. Okay, how does the human flourish? It flourishes when mother sun, when she creates sort of fences around that jungle oxen, keeps that jungle oxen and rears that jungle oxen. When does a person die? The person dies when mother sun, when a spirit shaman comes to the mother sun and requests that soul. If she gives away that jungle oxen to be sacrificed, then the human will die. Why is the jungle oxen sacrificed? Well, it sort of has a deep cosmological significance of healing the earth, in quite a deep way. There was in the rituals, they were often referenced to the spirits that would contain the hanging basket in which chickens produced eggs. Yeah, the emphasis upon fencing fields was essential for marauding animals there, and as well. So you had this very deep conception of the value of bordering and the value of and how that affected human health. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks, Alex. There's a question from Ingrid, and she's had to leave early, so I'll try to ask it and sort of layer in some of my own questions. She asks, knowing the wildlife trade also in pangolins is one of the 3 most thriving illegal international trades worldwide, how can communities engage with, in parentheses, international law enforcement without losing livelihoods and not being vilified? And I guess kind of my sort of piggyback question is law enforcement even visible in these places? Is the state visible? Or is it sort of a more removed entity that you only interact with when you're participating in regional markets?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it was completely absent when I first went there, and it's still largely absent, especially in the uplands. So there was no forest department office in the uplands. It was totally managed by local people, and the wildlife trade remains, very unpoliced. It's it's partly due to the proximity between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet, China. So local people, they do have a lot of power, and the Indian government is very careful to maintain good relationship with the tribe, especially on the border. So the level of policing is pretty minimal up in the uplands, but also in the middle belt and down in the lower belt. So it really goes on. This is one of the reasons why I feel it's so important to create a dialogue between conservationists and indigenous people there, because this intermediary, this idea of protectionist sort of visions or forest or fortress conservation, which you see in other parts of India, is not going to happen in Arunachal anytime soon. People need to work with local people and how they understand the world around them and their ways of knowing. And this, still remains very much perspectivist in orientation. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You've got your hand up. Do you have a question, Sevki?
Me? Yeah. I have. Thank you, Alex. I have a question which I'm still struggling to find my position, and you seem the right person to provide insight somehow. And somehow when we consider, I think somehow keeping different diverse way of valuing and engaging with species is quite important when we consider particularly the homogenization of food and industrial farming and food practices, which has a wider environmental effects as well. But as we see in your cases, it's drift to extinctions as well. So how to balance it? I mean, how to keep such a diverse way of engaging with species and so still somehow, somehow to protect this kind of, prevent this kind of problems as well. What do you think about that?
Thanks for the question. It's a really difficult. It's just to square this circle is extremely difficult, because there's a lot of forces that are at work in even somewhere like Arunachal Pradesh, which is historically quite very remote. I personally don't think that the cash economy I think it's going to bring its own logic to bear, and that will carry on. There's very little you can do when you look at the power relations at local level. In Arunachal, those who are educated are largely educated by Christian missionary organizations working with their base in South India, in Kerala, and so who's getting educated? Well, it's the emerging middle class in Arunachal are largely Christian. Okay, that then feeds into the administration, into the police force, into the bureaucracy, into the political elite. So you have a different way of understanding that's moving through the area. How you then preserve or sort of maintain this sort of diverse ways of understanding? Well, I found that often people don't just switch from one way of seeing to another. That there's this kind of oscillation that goes on often, and this sort of synergistic kind of ideas that come about. So an example would be, when I went to when I was talking with one of the villagers one time, he said, "Oh, in the prayer hut in Kaloriang, they said you should not work on Sunday. Yeah, you should not work on Sunday. Yeah, but I worked in my field on Sunday. But I worked under the shadow of a tree. So what God would see me then? And it's a classic kind of case of linking the Christian God with mother sun and the shadow that is provided by the tree. This idea, you get these synergistic ideas, and they're often latent. I also actually, one of the fundamental sort of convictions that I have is that perspectivist ways of understanding the world, they're actually very normal and very usual and very habitual for a lot of us. You know, we do it all the time. We are, you know, we're continually gauging others' reactions to us and feeding in and sort of working out how to behave in relation to others' perceptions and others' values. And this goes right back, you know, perspectivism, and it goes right back to the sort of, you know, the most ancient of times. But it's you know, some cognitive, you know, psychologists might call it mentalization. Some cognitive anthropologists might call it second order intentionality. The fact is, we're good at it. As humans, we're extremely capable at thinking through the other. And it doesn't take much for us to think through the other. You look at climate change and how people encounter a storm, and then, you know, they sort of they upscale it to, as Eduardo Cohn would say, they upscale it to, you know, to climate change, or upscale it to the sort of, people have often taken storms and seen it as the actions of ecological sovereignties. I think this is really a very sort of habitual way of understanding, and it doesn't take much to then take that understanding and reactivate it in different conservation scenarios. You just need I think, in my view, you need the methods that will allow that. You need the methods that will allow that kind of vicarious thinking or thinking through the detour of the other to find a place within discussions of wildlife. And it's one of those things that gets cut when you think in purely naturalistic terms, I think. So that's my personal view on way. And so, that's what I think.
Yeah. My question was rather related to the consumption, the commodity, the consumption side of the commodity chain, to somehow preserve the diverse array of consumptions of other species as well. So so because we have dilemma here, we have to somehow, to protect the species, we have to somehow also prevent this kind of diverse way of the eating or using a species, which I think is quite important to preserve them against the industrialization as well. I was asking the dilemma of this side, actually.
Okay, I mean, this goes into the heart of villagers' conceptions, in my view, or of how they understand forests. I mean, you know, the borders that people create at local level in the uplands of Arunachal Pradesh, they don't prevent consumption. They're not aiming for a blanket ban on consuming certain animals, although some are considered to be, you know, like the Sanankuri, the spotted linsang, you know, that's really off limit. You really don't want to hunt that. And there's other animals that have that kind of resonance. But what they're aiming for, if there's a value that really informs people's consumption of animals, it's to achieve something like productive exchange across a border. So some mutually productive exchange with spirits. Okay, so that might mean that you take into consideration the values and the cares of those spirits, and also maybe give them some sacrifices from your village. But it also means that you can receive certain animals within that scenario as well. So there is a room for diverse consumption at the local level, if you're talking about a purely local village level consumption of wildlife. But then again, the roads grow, the cash economy expands, and now those are the main factors that will drive what will be consumed and how it will be consumed, and at what sort of scale it will be consumed. Yeah, and that's really something that conservationists have to take into account.
So we're right on time to end, and I've got one final question, and it's basically in relation to you know, our news reports about pangolins, you know, circling back to this part of the world, and if so, how is that changing perceptions of the pangolins? And maybe it's a two-part question. Also, you're the only expert thus far that we've been able to speak with about this international illicit economy related to pangolin meat. Do you have a sense that it's still operating, or has it just been totally shut down? I know that China eliminated a lot of the wildlife markets right after the outbreak last year. So two-part question, is the illegal trade of pangolin still a very big part of the international market share in this illicit economy? And second, how have if you're able to maintain contact with people, how have perceptions of pangolins changed during the pandemic?
I think those are fundamental questions, but I haven't been in enough contact with the people in the uplands in the last year or two. I went back in 2018 and spoke to people then, but that was prior to the pandemic. So how they've shifted and how, my guess, and this is just really an educated guess, is that the communication, the way that a ban on pangolin meat or scales might feed back to local level there'd be quite a significant delay. When the 2007, 2008 credit crunch hit, the global economy, it really had no impact in the uplands. It was just zero. People really hadn't heard of it. So it was, and it didn't seem to affect anything. So I would be surprised if it had dented practices already, although, however, they can feed back to, there are only a series of nodes in the commodity chain where that information could feed back to the local level. What I would say is that kind of vision that Candea has as communication as a mode of detachment, I think that it could potentially feed into that mode of detachment, whereby in the sort of traditional mode, people have detached themselves from certain forms of wildlife because of the dangers inherent in hunting them. But I think that would be for the next field trip to see. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex. It was a real delight to read this paper.
Great.
Thank you. All around. And it looks like Sarah has just joined us. So Sarah, you're an hour late, so you can go back and watch. It'll be on YouTube. So Rachel, who's on for next week? I don't recall.
Holly High, who I think
Holly
is working
High.
on.
Great.
What is she working on?
So Holly High is a colleague of mine here at Deakin University. She's studied an earlier viral outbreak in a village in Laos, and it's sort of a participant observation account of, I believe it's H1N1 emerging with some chickens that she actually purchased at a local market. So it's a very situated account of an earlier scare about a pandemic. So yeah, I didn't realize she's giving a talk to our local group too. So she's busy next week. All right. Well, thanks again, Alex. Feel free to come back. Hope to see you in another Zoom room sometime soon.
Great. Continue your fantastic work. Yeah.
Thanks.